Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth and a professor of economics. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Brooks Family Lecture. The first 100 days, is America great again yet? Presented by Megan McArdle. Ms. McArdle is a columnist for Bloomberg View with over 15 years of writing in the blogosphere. That is equal parts English degree from Pennsylvania and M.B.A. from Chicago. The Brooks Family Lecture was established in 1990 by a gift from Dexter Brooks, a member of the Dartmouth class of 1947 and the Amos Tuck School class of 1949, who had a successful career in publishing and real estate. The Brooks Family Lecture has been a mainstay of Rockefeller Center programming for the last 25 years. Mr. Brooks passed away some years ago, and we are honored to carry some of his legacy at Dartmouth through this annual event. If you can believe it, we had our last Brooks Family Lecture the day after Super Tuesday last year, when Donald Trump took a large step toward his party's nomination. And if you can believe it, he went on to win the presidency and is now almost 100 days into his term of office, a milestone when we typically take a moment to reflect on the established direction and achievements of the new administration. What have we learned? I think the most honest answer, and not for the first time, by the way, is that governing is much harder than campaigning, and making America great, perhaps through really effective governing, is harder still. In fact, I would go a step further and say that America in 2017, at the federal level at least, is nearly ungovernable, and that is now paired with an administration that is not well poised to govern. Kind of a mess, I'd say. At moments like this, I look for interesting voices and workable solutions. Our guest today is one of the most thoughtful and prolific columnists you can find. One of the pioneers of blogging, with stints at The Economist and the Daily Beast, in addition to independent work and feature and book-length writing, Megan McArdle is both thought leader and public intellectual, bringing to bear economic reasoning and a libertarian perspective to shape and improve the quality of public debate. A quick trip to her Bloomberg View archive will reveal column after column of practically minded commentary on healthcare, politics, and public policy, as well as culture and food. She has no patience for the smugness that so often passes for elite political and social commentary these days, and she suffers no fools. On consecutive days last month, she published columns with the headlines, "Attention Student Protesters, Use Your Words," and "The Republican Plan is Even Worse Than Obamacare." If you're like me, you're tired of the noise and you want some honesty and clarity and maybe some elegance in our public discourse, you could do a lot worse than making Megan McArdle one of your daily reads. We are very fortunate to be able to share her insights on some of the most interesting first 100 days in American history. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Megan McArdle.
Thank you. My mic is on. Good. So I'm going to try to talk for about 40 minutes, and then which I see will put me at just 45 after 5, and then take some questions. And I'll start by talking about what does the first 100 days mean? Right. This is the metric that we've been using for decades now when we stare hard at a president's first 100 days, but in some sense this is completely arbitrary, right? If we each had an extra finger on each hand, it would be the first 144 days. There is nothing special about 100 days, and in fact, it hasn't been that effective a metric for presidents for a while. If you look at FDR, he comes in, he's bang, 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 lots of laws come out. FDR is living in a very different time from the time that we are in government. First of all, FDR is coming in at a time of unprecedented crisis, even compared to the financial crisis. The financial crisis was like the JV version of the Great Depression, right? Unemployment in the Great Depression spiked up to 25%. You have banks failing left and right all across the country. People are losing their savings. People are out of work. People are getting foreclosed on. And he's coming in not just at a time when the crisis is bigger. And we do know that presidents have much more space to move in a crisis than at any other moment. So if you look at 2001, when the Twin Towers come down. So one of the interesting things is that in New York, on average, it takes about 20 years to build a building. It didn't take any 20 years to deal with the World Trade Center, and we don't need those regulations, right? When people really want to get that stuff out of the way, somehow all of these procedural hurdles that have been there for everyone else just vanish into the ether. So that's part of it, and certainly in 2008, right, if you look at how fast Bush is able to move on something like TARP, and then Obama is able to move on something like the stimulus, this is just much faster than anything like that could happen now. But the second thing that has happened between FDR and us is that government has just gotten phenomenally slower. So if you look at the Hoover Dam, right, the Hoover Dam is conceived and built in like 10 years. Let us compare this to my favorite example, the Southeastern High-Speed Rail Corridor. Southeastern High-Speed Rail Corridor is the idea that it would be nice if trains in the South ran a little bit faster. This was proposed in 1993. It's just finished up its environmental impact statement and this is to run something on existing rail bed that will go marginally faster than the trains we run now. What happened in between those two things? A couple things happened. First of all, there's a legal revolution that really starts partly because of the New Deal, in fact. So if you look at what's happening on the Supreme Court, I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with the FDR packing the Supreme Court scandal. It didn't actually happen. There's some controversy over whether the switch in time saved 9. I don't think that the Senate was prepared to allow him to pack the Supreme Court even if that hadn't happened. But nonetheless, there's a shift in judicial philosophy that takes place starting under FDR and really moving rapidly into the post-war period. And so liability, for example, gets widely expanded. If you look at what you could sue for in the 20s with, say, asbestos or manufacturing defects, right? If something was defective, you could sue over it. But something that was just maybe kind of not a good design idea, you can't sue for that. All of these lawsuits that we had in the 70s over automobiles and so forth, those were not possible before this legal revolution. And this legal revolution starts infecting government. So first of all, judges are more willing to restrict what governments can do. You know, if you look at what Robert Moses did in New York City, right? He's just, I think I will knock that neighborhood down. And then he knocks it down and it goes away. That stops really being possible starting in the 60s. And if you look at what is happening to John Lindsay, when he becomes mayor of New York, you know, he wants to do something that we're still talking about now, scatter site public housing. So the idea is that you build small housing projects all over so that they're more economically integrated with the rest of the city. Well, in 1940, he could have done it. In 1965, no way. He starts, in his second term, he starts trying to do scatter site housing. A young lawyer named Mario Cuomo gets together with some Queens homeowners and says, hell no, and makes that stick. Right? So it is now less possible to do things with government. Meanwhile, we have other regulations, environmental regulations. We have more public comment periods. We have more review for how agencies are supposed to do things. And then on top of that, there is a legislative revolution. So after Watergate, a wave of radical people gets swept into the House, and they reform how the House works. So this progressive wave, basically, it used to be when FDR wanted to do something, he basically needed to get like 4 guys to agree to do it. And then it happened, because those people would discipline their parties to go along. This is not entirely true, but it's kind of basically true about how government operated prior to this revolution. Afterwards, proliferating committees and subcommittees. We also have, and I'll be talking about this more a little bit later, fragmented how government works, how much discipline parties have over their membership. All of these things have radically slowed down the ability of a president to just come in and be like, if any of you watch Star Trek of the Next Generation, to be like Captain Jean-Luc Picard and just say, make it so. That does not happen anymore. So Donald Trump, I think it is fair to say, has not done as much as he wanted in his first 100 days. There's an article in Politico in the last few days talking about how his administration is panicking because they only have 2.5 weeks left and then it's all over, right? That's not really a problem. The problem with the Trump administration is not that they haven't done what they meant to do in their first 100 days, because no one does. If you look at Bush, yes, he did No Child Left Behind sort of in his first 100 days, but it didn't pass until May. That was his big bipartisan education initiative that he worked on with Teddy Kennedy. Obama, he got the stimulus done in February. But what are the other 2 big legislative achievements that we remember Obama for? Obamacare happened in 2010. Took an entire year. And at that, it was probably rushed. And then Dodd-Frank, the big financial reform, also happened in 2010. Did not happen in the first 100 days of his presidency. So What we're looking at is a situation in which no president really gets that much done in the first 100 days, merely because they're now so caught up in the process of getting people staff appointed so that they can then go and do something. Something else we should remember is that FDR was inaugurated later. So he had a longer transition period in which to line up who his staff were going to be before he had to actually start doing stuff. So these are all differences in the presidency that have made the 100 days a less useful metric. But, and I apologize, I just need to switch my notes periodically. But there's still issues with the Trump presidency. And what we have learned in the first 100 days is troubling for what is to come in the next 365, 365, 365. We've got a long ways to go, and Donald Trump still isn't prepared for them. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about what's gone wrong with the Trump presidency so far. And it really starts with a lack of preparedness for the presidency. After that, we have a lack of interest in the presidency, which is really one of the reasons he wasn't so prepared. A lack of institutional support from his own party. A lack of administrative infrastructure. Fierce opposition from the cosmopolitan class that he ran against. I'm sure it was a lot of fun to run against judges right up to the point where they started overruling his executive orders. Obstructionist Democrats, let's be honest. The shoe is now on the other foot, and they are enjoying how it feels. And then Trump's personality. So let's start with his lack of preparedness for the presidency. What was Trump's goal in running for president? That is exactly it. And in fact, we're pretty sure, you can never know, right? These are all third party. I have not sat down with Donald Trump and had a heart-to-heart with him about it. I am pretty sure that Donald Trump had no intention of becoming president when he declared to run. Right? What he wanted to do was kind of finish high. It would be good publicity for his businesses and so forth. And then something kind of funny happened. He started to win. And this was basically a complete accident. Let's talk about all the things that had to line up to make Donald Trump become president. So first of all, we need 19 candidates in the race. But not just 19 candidates, because that happened before, right? In 2012, you've got a bunch of random people. In fact, when Clinton was running, what do we have, the 7 dwarves they were talking about? Look, this is a common thing that happens. You get a very crowded field, people kind of jockey around for a while. What was different this time? Well, one thing that was different was that the donor class went all in on a no-hope candidate. And look, I like Jeb Bush. I think he's a real nice guy. I think he's a pretty good governor of Florida. His last name was toxic. His brother left office with some of the lowest approval ratings we have on record for a president. Also, his dad had been president, the last Republican president, right? That was an unwinnable combination in the general election, even if it had somehow managed to eke out the primary. But by long before the primaries started, it was clear he was not going to eke out the primaries. And yet, this guy had raised $100 million. He had sucked up all of the donor oxygen. He then decided, for reasons that are not clear to anyone, to incinerate all of that money, taking down the only viable mainstream candidate in the race, Marco Rubio. After Scott Walker dropped out, it became pretty clear that there was only one person who could reach across enough people to kind of carry the suburban voters and also grab the evangelical base that they needed to combine with those two people in order to go across the finish line in the general election. It was also clear that he was beating Jeb Bush. So what did Jeb Bush decide to do? Spend all the money running ads against Marco Rubio. Even at the point where it was clear that even if Marco Rubio lost, Jeb Bush was not going to win. So you have a mainstream candidate who has gathered all of the money and used it to take down the most viable candidate they have in his kind of space in the primary. You then have John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, who for reasons that no one can understand decides to keep in the race long after the point at which it is clear that there is no possible way he can win the right-wing base. He does really well in the suburbs. He does really well with moderate Republicans. No one else likes him. Even the moderate Republicans, a lot of them like Marco Rubio better. Nonetheless, he stays in and splits the vote just enough to deny Rubio a win in Virginia, which was the win that he needed to stay competitive, really, and knock Trump out of the race. Meanwhile, you have Ted Cruz, whose strategy is to get. Now, Cruz, I will say, Cruz and Rubio were the most two rational people. They ran as long as they could. Then they stayed in trying to just coordinate to get Trump out. Everyone else in this race is doing a lot of really kind of not very understandable things in a fit of pique at other candidates that are, even if they manage to knock that candidate off, they are not going to get the presidency. Into that chaos walks Donald Trump. Donald Trump is really good at being famous, right? He is exceptional at being famous. He is probably, since Ronald Reagan, the best president we have had at being famous. He's also, though, he's got this gift. He is the world's greatest political A/B tester. So for those of you who don't know what this is, A/B testing is like when Capital One sends out mailers. Capital One is, by the way, the world's greatest credit card A/B tester. What they do is they'll design a mailer, and they'll design two different versions of it. And they'll send out a bunch, and they'll be like, this one works better than that one. So they'll take that mailer, and then they'll design two different versions of that. And they'll send those out. Which one works better? They're constantly doing this, constantly refining their marketing. Trump is an incredibly effective A/B tester. He floats an idea, and then he just sees if it works. And then if it works, he keeps on with it. And if it doesn't, if his polls go up, he keeps on with it. And if they don't, he just walks it back. But why can he do this? Precisely the thing that no one else has, which is that the man, as far as I can tell, has no political philosophy other than winning. Right? He thinks, if you look at the way he crafts positions, and I would talk to a lot of his supporters, and they would say, well, he was against the Iraq War. He wasn't against the Iraq War when it was prospective. He was against losing wars. Right? I think we're all against retrospectively losing wars. The War of 1812, terrible idea, guys. I'm against it, but I don't know that that's how I would have voted in 1812. But because of that, right, because he doesn't have any sort of coherent idea of governance, he's not interested in governance. And I think that's quite clear, is that he is not interested in the actual day-to-day job of being president. Because you saw this on the campaign trail, where he doesn't really read. One of his biographers has said that he has never in his adult life read a book. He's getting all the way through. He's getting all of his news, as far as we can tell, from cable TV, or virtually all of it. He's not a reader. He was clearly not mastering the details of his briefing books. So if you look at what he was doing, for example, on healthcare, right? They had given him one extremely simple talking point on healthcare, which was we should sell insurance across state lines. Now, as these things go, as a policy idea, this is just kind of irrelevant. It's basically like arguing about whether we should paint hospital walls blue or gray. I mean, go nuts, guys. It's not actually going to change very much. But the thing about this is that it can be explained really easily. Right? It's what I call a Washington idea. It's an idea of great public charm and no actual practical import. So bringing back Glass-Steagall is the perfect Washington idea. It wouldn't do anything, but you can explain it to someone who doesn't know anything about finance in under a minute. And so similarly, they picked this one policy idea. Donald Trump couldn't remember this one policy idea. It became clear multiple times in debates when he would mangle the line and someone would ask him to clarify and he couldn't, that he had not only forgotten allow insurance to be sold across state lines, that was too long a sentence for him to have remembered. I mean, campaigning is really tiring, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of those sentences that you have to remember, but he had forgotten it. He had not only forgotten the sentence, he had forgotten what it referred to. That was the level at which he was interested in doing policy. He didn't have a political philosophy. He didn't have a policy philosophy. The things that were his biggest kind of consistent policy ideas were like construction, right? Build a wall. Because that's something he's done. And so we had this kind of accidental president. And he came into office, he happened to hit kind of a sweet spot, both in terms of just the chaos of the primaries, but also, let's be honest, he resonated with voters for a reason. And the reason he resonated with those voters is that people were sick of hearing basically the same things being said over and over, which was functionally what had happened in both parties. That all of these people are promising that these things are going to make your lives better, right? Republicans have tax cuts, which they talk about over and over and over again. regardless of your opinion of those tax cuts as a policy thing, most people in this country don't really pay income taxes. In the 70s and 80s, when Reagan ran on those things, they did. Now they don't. They don't care. That's not a winning policy platform anymore. Because for most people, that's just not an issue. It's a big issue for the Republican donor class. It's not a big issue. That is not a pocketbook issue for the average American voter. Meanwhile, Democrats are out there promising like all of these micro-targeted things. We're gonna have free college for your kids. Well, if you're not sending your kids to college, what does that do for you? Which a lot of the Trump voters weren't. So why do they care if someone else's kid goes to college for free? Or we'll do paid family leave. Well, what if I'm 50 and my kids are grown? Right, there's all of these micro-targeted things to constituencies, but nothing for large swaths of the country that felt like no one was speaking to them or for them. And who they felt, with some justice, looked down on them. That group of people struck back. They didn't want the kind of micro-targeted programs from Democrats, and they didn't want tax cuts. What they wanted was the society, the economy they had in 1970. Now, I don't think they can have that economy. I think that ship sailed. But Donald Trump at least told them, look, I can do something. And he had kind of his own Washington idea, a simple, intuitive explanation that made sense to them, and it resonated. And he angered a lot of people who they felt looked down on them. And they liked that. And they felt like he was a businessman, and businessmen could go into Washington and do something. I think Donald Trump also thought that having run a business would allow you to go into Washington, and instead of just being this insider who would capitulate to the system, you come in from the outside and show them how a real business should work. And the problem is Washington is not a business. I used to think like this. 10 years ago, before I moved to Washington, I thought like this, and then I moved to Washington and saw how difficult it is to get anything done in this city. Not because people don't understand how to run things, although that is often a problem, but because we have so many interlocking layers of controls and bureaucracy. It is not possible to do things like a business. It's like doing something like a business if you had a 535-member board of directors who could overrule you whenever you wanted to spend any money, right? That's a really hard way to run a business, which is why no one does. Look, lots of people come in wanting to win. Like, we really underestimate this. If you look at who becomes president, these guys are plotting out their presidency long before they know anything about politics or have a political philosophy. The desire to become president was first. Afterwards, they filled in the details. But by the time they get to the office, they've done a couple things. First of all, they do have a political philosophy. They have things they believe in. They have spent time thinking about policy. They have policies they believe in. And they've spent time in a party. They have party loyalty. They want their party to succeed. Right? If you look at how George Bush has behaved in the 8 years since he I think, genuinely cares about his country and refrains from saying things that would hurt his country, refrains from saying things publicly about other presidents, which I think is really admirable. But he also cares about his party. If staying in the background helped his party, he would do that. If not, if they had needed him to go out and campaign, and if he thought that would help, he would have done it. Right? That is how most politicians come into the office. They have relationships and loyalty to their party as well as to their ideas. Donald Trump came in with none of that. And it turned out that that stuff is kind of necessary to get things done in Washington. So Trump came in having made a bunch of vague and totally incoherent promises. He came in having said, what was his policy on Obamacare? It was going to be great, right? That's not a policy. That's a desire. He was going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Now, he can build a wall. I think that's actually within what he may achieve in the next 4 years. But building a wall is not adequate to do what he wants to do, and some of the other things that he wants to do are going to be really difficult and require the cooperation of Congress. They're going to encounter legal opposition, and he didn't have a plan for that. He's definitely not going to make Mexico pay for it. That's not going to happen. It was never going to happen. He wants to renegotiate trade deals. That he can do. He can basically blow up trade deals single-handedly. However, that's an easy thing to say when business and donors aren't kind of taking you seriously when you say it. If he actually tries to do it, he's going to suddenly find out there's a lot of American businesses, big American businesses, that would be massively disrupted. If he just starts, say, chopping up auto supply chains, that's going to be a problem. And he's going to encounter some big difficulties in getting these things through. If he takes us out of the WTO, he's going to suddenly find that other countries can retaliate against our products and not have any consequences to them. That there are, in fact, big reasons not to do all the things he promised to do, and that in some ways he didn't understand that because he didn't spend enough time either staffing up his campaign with people who could tell him stuff, and then spend time listening to them tell him those things. Huge tax cuts, right? Donald Trump's tax cuts, he was promising to spend almost $1 trillion a year by one estimate. There are some kinder estimates from more right-leaning groups. I think $1 trillion a year is probably close to right. How is he gonna pay for this? Crickets. He never even suggested growth was gonna be like, I don't know, 97% a year. Short of that, he didn't have a plan to do any of this, and he didn't understand that there were constraints. He was gonna do infrastructure. Well, what infrastructure and where does the money come from? Everything in Washington right now, the fundamental thing you have to understand about Washington right now is that everything is about the money. There isn't any. Right? All of the money is gone. It's all going into entitlements right now. 2/3 of our budget is completely outside of the control of the president unless you blow up some major entitlement program. Okay, that's probably not gonna happen because those people vote, and many of them voted for Donald Trump. Jobs, he's gonna do jobs. Well, what does that mean? Everyone wants to do jobs. How do you get jobs? Even if he does something, even if you think that the kind of traditional Republican plans, even if you think that cutting marginal tax rates by 25% is gonna create jobs, it's not gonna create jobs in his term. It's gonna create jobs in like 10 years. It takes a long time for policies like that to work. So he made a bunch of promises. He wrote a lot of checks that he couldn't really cash during the campaign. That always happens, by the way. Every president has come in having promised things that are wildly unrealistic. Obama was certainly, let us say, creatively optimistic about whether he was going to be able to do healthcare without a mandate. And a bunch of other things besides, right? Obama's policies, even the ones that he got to do the way he wanted, did not turn out the way he promised. Because that's the reality. You buff it up a little. You just put a little extra shine on the fenders before you take it out to show people. It's going to come off in the first rain, but that's how you sell the car. That's politics. But Donald Trump was completely unmoored from any need to vaguely reflect reality. Most politicians sort of have what they say has a relationship to reality. It is not reality, but it pays tribute, let us say. Donald Trump didn't do that, right? This was a non-traditional campaign and it worked, but then it leaves you in the bad position of having to actually deliver on this stuff or anger a bunch of your voters. He also just didn't know what it was going to take to do things. He didn't have the advisors who could tell him. And he didn't kind of try to find out. I think the most telling anecdote about this administration in a lot of ways is that when the Obamas were giving them the tour of the White House after he got elected, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, asked someone of the White House staff, of the 4,000 White House staff, how many of these people will be staying on after the election? They were like, none. Right, that's a really weird question to be asking after the election. He actually, after he was elected, had no idea that he was going to have to replace all these people. He had no idea, like, how the basic functions of the presidency worked. And then you look at the Russia scandals, and I think Mark Cuban has advanced kind of the most realistic version of these scandals, which is that Trump probably got caught up in a web of Russia-connected people just because he didn't know, right? Like, he likes Russia because they're nice to him. He likes Russia, he's done business there, they're friendly to him, right? But he didn't have the kind of political savvy to see that when he took these people on, it could be a problem later for administration, as it then became. And of course, when Russia, it looks like, potentially hacked the DNC in order to release Hillary's emails, do I think Trump knew about that in advance? No, I don't. I will come out and say that. Is that a problem for him, given how deeply he had gotten his campaign involved with all of these kind of Russian-affiliated people? Yes, it's a big problem for him. And a normal politician would have avoided that scandal, and he didn't. And this all follows from his lack of interest in the presidency. We've discussed this a little bit. He still seems kind of largely uninterested. Right? He's going to Mar-a-Lago every weekend. Why? He's stayed at a phenomenal number of his own properties during his presidency and is holding meetings there. Right? He's basically using the presidency as an advertising outlet for his business. That is not the normal way the priorities work once you get the presidential office. But I think a more telling example is the American Health Care Act, or as I like to call it, the AHA. This did not catch on, so I'm There's a kind of political syllogism popularized by Yes Minister that's one of my favorite things ever. Number one, something must be done. Number two, this is something. Number three, therefore this must be done. That is a pretty good description of what happened with the AHA. In part because this was not entirely Trump's fault. Republicans had not prepared at all. They're like, the metaphor that's been used a lot is the dog that finally caught the car. And that's pretty accurate. It's not that there were plans floating around in the Senate and in the House to do something about healthcare. No one had gotten any consensus on them. There was the Democrats, when they went in, if you look at Obama and Clinton, they're running on the same healthcare plan, except that Obama is just not gonna have a mandate, except it has to, so that it's not even a difference, right? The differences were trivial. It's because the Democrats knew basically the framework they were gonna use, and the Republicans basically didn't. They had a coalition that wanted to repeal everything, but didn't understand the political costs of doing so. They had moderates who basically didn't want to do anything, and I think still don't, because they would get in trouble with their constituents if their healthcare coverage went away. And they had not built up a coalition of people who, first of all, agreed on a plan, and second of all, were willing to pay the political price for it. So that's not Trump's fault. What's Trump's fault is that he's pressing them to just do something, do something, do something, do something. They weren't ready to do something. They didn't have the votes to do something. They didn't even know what something was. And so they put forward, they kind of cobbled together what they could for sort of arcane parliamentary reasons that I won't get into. They cobbled together a bill that was going to be really unpopular and result in a lot of people losing healthcare coverage and also score not very well from the Congressional Budget Office and a bunch of other stuff. It did score as reducing the deficit, but then they started having to fix it because of all the politically unpopular bits, and then the deficit reduction started going away immediately. And which Democrats were in no way ever going to cooperate with, leaving them needing every single member of their caucus to vote for it, basically. It was a tactical mistake, regardless of what you think about the policy elements of it. Politically, they got right up to the edge of a vote, and then we're just like, I don't know, never mind, right? That's not a good way. It has been done before, right? They were whipping votes for TARP. The first vote failed, right? But we're in the middle of a financial crisis, and we need to do something to the banking system. Then yes, you're like, I don't know, guys, maybe we'll all die. Go over the hill anyway, right? But in normal political process, there was no urgency to do this fast, except that Donald Trump just wanted to do tax reform. He didn't want to do healthcare. He didn't want to talk about it on the stump. And so he displayed no leadership on it. His idea of leadership was get everyone in a room and threaten them, and the threats failed. And that cost him political capital, right? When you threaten someone and then it turns out that they don't care about your threat, you suddenly have a lot less power. So all of these things that he did, they were not well thought out, they were not planned, and it turned into a legislative debacle. He's not the only person who bears blame for that legislative debacle, but he bears a lot of it. It's also not staffed up. When I talk about lack of institutional support from his party, right? Again, partly because he didn't come up through the normal party apparatus, but even more so because he clearly was willing to torch the party at any turn if it benefited Donald Trump. And was not shy about basically saying that in the open, right? Where he's threatening to go independent if he doesn't win, right? His party doesn't like him. And I'm talking about the institutional, the leaders in the party. They're afraid of him. They don't like him. And they are only interested in him succeeding insofar as that is critical to their party's future. They are not interested in him succeeding because they want Trump to do well, because they have any loyalty whatsoever to him. Well, when you need people to take a tough vote, when you need someone to lean into the strike zone and take one for the team, if they don't like you and don't really care if you fail as long as it doesn't hurt them, that is a bad place to be in. That is the place that Donald Trump put himself in by going nastily after two fairly powerful members of the Senate, and by being openly willing to destroy the party at any moment if they didn't do exactly what he wanted. He also, most of the normal public intellectuals, I shouldn't say most, many, maybe most of the normal public intellectuals who would staff his administration just refused. And I actually talked through this with several of them. People who I know would have been in any other Republican administration sat it out. He basically, almost everyone in the foreign policy community has sat it out. They don't want to be within 1,000 yards of this thing, right? So because of that, he's having difficulty staffing up his administration. And he has all of these people out there writing op-eds about how terrible he is, right? These, again, are not good places to be in with your party. A lot of staunch GOP donors don't really like him either. And so you're already seeing in Kansas, they just had a tough by-election. They did win it, but it was hard fought because the party itself is not cohesive or coherent, and he needs that in order to get something done. Meanwhile, the staff he does have is at war. I'm sure many of you have read in the papers about all of the different things that have gone on inside the White House. Now, all of this infighting happens, right? Presidential administrations look a little bit like Versailles right before the regime comes down, right? I mean, there's a lot of backstabbing. There's a lot of people worrying about who's getting more face time with the president and bad-mouthing each other off the record. You know, high-level senior official says, usually doesn't start like a month into the presidential term. There is usually a honeymoon period where everyone's like, okay, guys, we're going to do some great stuff. I'll stab you in the back later. It started immediately. And it's kind of open now that Steve Bannon, who is one of his big alt-right guys, is at war with his son-in-law. He has 2 advisors in his son-in-law and his daughter, who are kind of obviously not really Republicans, which is weird for a Republican president. It's usually not one of your closest advisors. You've got these reshuffles already being talked about. You've got staffers who are obsessed with traveling with the president. This is a big thing now. Everyone has to travel. He's got this huge entourage, right? Because they feel like if they let him go, bad things will happen and they won't be able to control them. So this is a big problem for his administration. They're spending a lot of time that they could be spending doing something, fighting with each other. And then you've got fierce opposition from the cosmopolitan class he ran against, which again was a lot of fun, right up into the point where the media and judges start batting down everything you say. And you know, like, if you look at what happened with his immigration ruling, right? And again, regardless of what you think of the policy, and in fact, I think that these rulings were wrong. I think that as a kind of legal matter, while I don't like, this is too mild a word to use, but I can't use another word in public. I really don't like his stance on immigration. I think that as a legal matter, he had the right to do those executive orders, and that the rationale in which they shot it down was pretty tenuous. That said, he may lose in court. And so things that he could have done if he had not been quite so open about promising a Muslim ban, he now may not be able to do. Judges are not fond of people who talk about judges like Donald Trump. They're not inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. Donald Trump spent a ferocious amount of political capital getting elected and has very little left to do things now that he's here. Obstructionist Democrats. I don't really need to belabor this, but let's talk about the Gorsuch filibuster for a minute. What was the point, right? There was a 0% chance that they were going to filibuster and Mitch McConnell was going to let that stand. Now you can say maybe that, fine, well then if we don't have the power, then what's the point of having the filibuster available? Here's the point of having the filibuster available. As we just noted, Donald Trump and his own party are not that friendly. So there is definitely a scenario where Donald Trump nominates someone who is obviously unfit and no one wants him, and the Republicans let the filibuster go forward to take that nominee out. Now they can't. Now you're putting them in a position where they have to vote up or down, right? Where they will be responsible to the base who wants them to be nice to Trump. Right, so you took out an institutional check that might actually have been really valuable against judges that Democrats and Republicans might really not want on the Supreme Court. For no reason, for no gain. That literally achieved nothing except pacifying some people in the base who wanted to see them. What did we just say? Something must be done, this is something, therefore this must be done. Same logic. And the last thing we have to talk about is, of course, his personality. Who insults the Prime Minister of Australia? This is like, they were like the only people who were like, we're going to war again. They're like, yeah, we're going with you. I don't even know where you're going. You don't need to tell me where we're going. We're there. Just tell me where to show up. Text me. Right? Why? What had the Prime Minister of Australia done to offend him? These are the things, right? He has very little impulse control. He has no attention to norms. I mean, the Mar-a-Lago stuff, using the presidency to advertise your own properties,
that's really destructive. Because it says that the presidency is not about America, it's about Donald Trump and what's good for Donald Trump. And like, look, that is always a little bit true, right? We don't, self-interest does not vanish the moment you walk into the Oval Office, but people do observe the proprieties. Donald Trump doesn't. And that helped get him elected because people were sick of some of the proprieties. But in office, it is extremely destructive both to our civil society and his own presidency. So where are we with the presidency? I'm just about to have to finish up, so I'll look, he's done the Gorsuch nomination. That was his only win. He said, as Chris Cillizza of the Washington Post recently said, he's had 2 good days in his presidency. The day he nominated Gorsuch and the day Gorsuch passed, right? Those are genuinely good days. Everything else has been some degree of meh to disaster. He's not gotten, and I would actually add the executive orders that he signed. Right now, he's kind of popular with his base for getting shot down by those judges. That may change, because I think what his base wanted was not to see someone who would just stand up to the cosmopolitan class, but someone who would win, who would beat them at their own game, who would deny them the means that they had been using to control the elite levers of society. If Donald Trump turns out to be if it turns out that the cosmopolitans can beat Donald Trump, and that in fact, like, he's just like them, I don't think he's actually gonna be that popular. That said, he's had a couple of good days. I think his executive orders, there are things he can still do. Let's list the things he has left to do. He still has to do healthcare. He has to do something about Obamacare because there are big problems. And those big problems are going to become a big problem for his administration. At some point or another, Republicans are going to have to get something done on healthcare. He wants to do a tax plan. I think that is very much yet to be seen. A lot of people are more confident than I am because, again, there's no money. Where are you going to get $1 trillion? Or Bush, the last big tax cut was Bush. He had a surplus to work with. He didn't have to find offsetting cuts. Once you have to find offsetting cuts, every one of those cuts is attached to an angry voter. That is going to be a big problem. And a lot of those angry voters, again, voted for Trump. Immigration, he can do a lot. I heard an estimate that he could basically be deporting 500,000 people a year without congressional help if they just changed the rules under which they did that. So that is something where, and border enforcement seems to like him. So immigration is something where he can actually be certainly meaningfully reducing the number of illegal immigrants we have in this country. And I think he may well get something through Congress as well. It will be contentious. The Republican donor class will not like what he does, but I think that is within the potential things that he may get done because Republicans are now enough afraid of their base to ignore their donors. And because I think Trump actually can lead on this because he really wants to. This was his signature issue. Infrastructure, same thing, where are you going to get the money? You want to do $1 trillion in infrastructure, you've got to find $1 trillion to pay for it. What are you going to cut or whose taxes are you going to raise? And that is going to be really different. You can do some deficit spending. I don't think as much as people hope. And I don't think the Trump administration has really thought this through yet. And then jobs. Everyone would love to do jobs. If we knew how to do jobs, we would have done jobs 30 years ago. Fundamentally, the reason we're not doing it, this is a rule in Washington. If something isn't being done, it's because it's hard. Either it's politically hard, or it's hard on a policy level, or no one really knows what will do it. But there is nothing out there that is not being done because it's easy and obvious. So he can do much less than he promised. He can do even less than that unless he develops some administrative competence, unless he builds some bridges to his own party. And certainly unless he gets an idea of what he wants to do, which is the biggest vacuum in the Trump presidency right now. He doesn't really have any sort of vision for what he wants the government to look like. But we can't control that. So I think the more important question is what we can do. Because everything that is wrong with the Trump administration is fundamentally, in the end, something that is wrong with us, with the American electorate, with American society. So what I mean by that, I want to think about what I call the 3 Ds, and then I will wrap up and take questions. I only do this because Columnist, you have to come up with like catchy taglines, so this is the 3 Ds. Disintermediation, divergence, and dysfunction. What do I mean by those things? Disintermediation, Facebook, social media. The gatekeepers, there is no sheriff in town. You cannot keep the gate on something that someone else wants to happen. Look at how effectively Trump used social media. Whatever else you think about him, he was incredibly effective at bypassing the gatekeepers who didn't like him. 20 years ago, that would have been nearly impossible to do. Dysfunction. So I talked at the beginning about the procedural reforms, places like Congress. It's not just Congress. Let's look at campaign finance reform, which has gutted the political parties, the power of the political parties, right? 40 years ago, and primary elections, that's the other one, the big one, okay? So 40 or 50 years ago, parties had a phenomenal amount of discipline over their members. They could control what committees you got on. If you were in Kansas, you wanted to be on the farm committee, so you better be nice, right? They could control whether you got money to run your campaign. They could control how much advertising you got, how much news coverage you got. So these disciplinary elements that allowed parties to keep themselves from fielding crazy candidates, to keep parties actually moving legislation forward, totally gone. We gutted them all in the name of good government. It is, I think, not so good. And the third thing is divergence, the great sort. We have all moved into areas where people are much more like us than used to be the case. I grew up in one of these areas, one of the first of these areas to emerge, which was, of course, the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the 70s and 80s. I knew a lot of people who'd been to socialist summer camp. I did not, as far as I knew, know anyone who was a Republican when I was growing up. It turned out my grandparents were Republicans, but I didn't know that until after I graduated college. My mother tells me that they didn't hide it from me. I'm not sure that this is the case. Places like this hate the people that are not like them because they don't know any of those people, right? And the more that we don't know them, the more easy it is to dehumanize them. The more easy it is to become interested only in defeating the other. And that is where we are. We've lost nationalism. And I know nationalism is supposed to be a dirty word, but nation building is really hard. If you look at what like Greece and Italy and Germany had to do in the 19th century to nation build, how phenomenally necessary it is to develop national identities, to tell people who they are, to tell people you are part of this national identity, to develop national myths that support that identity. It was really difficult. If you don't do that stuff, a lot of people thought that the alternative to nationalism, bad nationalism, was globalism, cosmopolitanism. No, it's tribalism. We don't go up when we lose our national identity. We go down to our constituent groups. That is where we are as a nation. We are going down to smaller and smaller groups. We are in that, I forget the poet who said, at the time of World War II, we must love one another or die. That is where we are as a nation right now. That is why Trump's presidency is such a shambles. It is because we are a shambles. And if we do not figure out a way to all hang together, then we may well all hang separately. So with that, I will close and open for questions. You have to get the mic. This is for posterity.
What is something good about the Trump administration versus what we might have had it been a Democratic presidency?
For me, I much prefer Republican Supreme Court justice nominees to liberal ones. So the Gorsuch nominee for me is an unmitigated win, right? And that was what a lot of evangelicals were saying. Look, yes, he is not really a Christian. Yes, he is not my idea, thrice divorced, the remarks that I will not repeat, something that might be seen by family members. We know that. He's not one of us. But we really care about abortion. We really care about religious liberty. And those justices are going to protect those things. I care about a slightly different set of issues, but that, I think for a lot of people, that's an absolute win. I think Gorsuch is a great justice. I think he's going to keep the court in more of a direction that I would certainly like to see in terms of economic freedom and a bunch of other issues. And religious liberty, which I care deeply about. As an American, I think it really is one of our sort of great fundamental liberties, and I don't like to see it infringed on. So in those directions, I think that's a big win for Trump. I think that the problem with Trump is not all of his ideas. I actually think, look, we needed to have a conversation about immigration, and we weren't having it. The idea was that we would just have a super liberal immigration policy by default, and that's a terrible way to run policy. And it was a politically unstable way to run policy. If we want, I favor high immigration levels. But if we want them, we have to have an honest national conversation about what that means and what the American public is willing to take. Because if you don't have that conversation, as we didn't, it boils up as rage. You cannot deny a major issue like that and just collectively agree among elites that you're just going to not talk about it and let something that a lot of people don't want to happen. So I think there are good things about the Trump presidency, but I think that he is his own worst enemy in a whole lot of ways, in terms of just getting done what he wants to get done. Yellow shirt. I think it's yellow.
Would you tell?
Oh, sorry. Yes, everyone, I'm sorry, if you could use the mic, because we want to get it on video.
Would you talk about the role of business and media on the increased divisiveness in the country?
I think the media plays some role in it, but it's a complicated role. Look, the media is like 95% liberal. We all know that. I certainly know it. I work in it. And I'm one of the few people in it who definitely could not be described as liberal. That is a problem. It's been a problem for a long time. I don't think that's the kind of fundamental problem. The larger problem is that media is dying, right? Wherever there are 2 or more journalists gathered together, there are 2 or more people saying, so what do we do when this isn't a job anymore? I've heard some very creative answers. I'm thinking goat farming. I've always liked goat cheese. And I bet the goats will listen to everything I have to say. So because of this, right, what you used to have in every city was at least one daily, and that daily and the television news tended to kind of cater to the median of their audience, right? Like the New York Times isn't liberal because everyone at the New York Times is in a big liberal conspiracy. The New York Times is liberal because their audience is liberal, right? The Post is conservative because their audience is conservative. New York Post, by the way, not the Washington Post. So as the funding mechanisms for those papers have gone away, there were a lot of places where that median looked a lot like the median of the country. But unfortunately, a lot of those places are kind of small and their papers are dying. And as media has, and this is what I talked about at disintermediance and divergence, right? Everything's a narrowcast now. You can pick a really niche audience and just cater to them. And like a lot of trash gets talked about the conservative, the kind of alt-right, Breitbarts and so forth. I have had my issues with them. But I will say, look, the liberal media got away with a lot of stuff before there were these web outlets to discipline them. They got away with a lot of stuff they should not have gotten away with. That said, the right doesn't have a New York Times, right? It has the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is the closest thing, but the news page is liberal. The right needs more kind of like mainstream-ish institutions journalistically, and they don't have them, in part because when you segment like that, right, when the mainstream is here, and then you define yourself as just the conservative, right? If everyone over here on the left finds it easy to move into the mainstream, and everyone over here on the right doesn't, well, the incentives then are to cater not to impressing people in the mainstream, but to impressing your donors and readers, who want you to be more focused. It's not about fact, by the way. Like the Weekly Standard, National Review, there are a ton of great outlets doing a lot of good reporting, but you tend to focus on kind of very specific ideological reporting rather than just being like, I went to a city council meeting, here's what happened, right? That kind of reporting is hard to sell to people who are reading you for specifically ideological reasons. But here's the thing that's going to be a problem on the right too, because all the stuff in the middle is going away. We still have not found a revenue method on the web, and we've been trying for 20 years now, right? It was 10 years ago, it was reasonable to think, oh, we'll figure it out. We're not figuring it out. It's getting worse, not better. So when that goes away, the left is going to look like the right. It's going to look exactly like the right. Why? Because they're going to have the same financial incentives. So that's going to be a real issue. This stuff is going to get worse. I do expect that to get worse unless we figure out a way to support nonpartisan media. You, sir?
Other than evil President Nixon, I think the chattering classes have all agreed since Eisenhower at least that Republican presidents aren't very bright. I concede the point about Donald Trump, and I figure in 6 months from now he's going to get fairly tired of doing all this.
I think he's tired now.
Nature abhors a vacuum. Who would you see as the players who are going to drive the agenda forward once Donald starts spending Monday through Friday in Florida?
That's really hard to imagine. I mean, I have put this to people who are kind of in the know about how these things work, and what they say is like, what you then get, if you imagine, everyone here I assume is familiar basically with the history of Julius Caesar and the Roman triumvirate, right? Is like, the problem is that what you get then is a power vacuum, where everyone's just jockeying and trying to kill each other. Someone needs to be in charge. And with the president not fulfilling that role, it's really hard to see what then happens. I don't think we know. I think it's a troubling question. I wish I had a better answer than that. You, sir?
Could you talk a little bit about the role of the Koch brothers, using that as a shorthand for that financial constellation, and of the intelligence community, both in terms of their clearing the way for Trump in the first instance for the Koch brothers, and in the intelligence community, and I guess the right donor class, or whatever you want to call the Koch brothers, is presenting an opposition center to him?
On the intelligence community, I don't think they were rooting for Trump. And I think if you look at what Comey did, I think it's really misunderstood. I think that didn't impact the election. But like, let's play this the other way around. You're Comey. You've now got documents unknown as of yet about her email server. You decide not to publicize them, and then 2 days after the election, it turned out that they were really damning. Right? That's a big problem for you. The problem that he had was that there was no way he could not affect the election. Or there was no way he could be certain he wasn't affecting the election. So I don't think that the criticism of him is fair. The deep state doesn't like Trump. I think that is a fair assessment. I think, but look, he's troubling, right? He has done some troubling things. Or I should say, he hasn't done them. I have no evidence that Trump has done anything troubling. I want to clarify that. He has some people around him who have troublingly deep ties to Russia, or has had them, at a time when Russia seems to have intervened in our election.
So you said that the Republican Party is now like really disunified. Do you think it's possible for Trump to unify the party, or the next president in 2020 or 2024 to unify the Republican Party?
He has unified the party more than it was. Having the White House is usually a somewhat unifying event. That said, I think he has so far not displayed the leadership that would be required to unify the party to the degree that would be most effective at getting his agenda passed. Let me say that. Other questions? I saw in the back there.
With the vacuum at the top, so to speak, I have some real concerns about external events and things that could very well go wrong, whether Korea or the Middle East or some other places like that. Are there enough adults around him that can kind of keep us out of really deep trouble?
Look,
do you
so
think?
far his cabinet appointments have been quite normal and good people. One of the questions, though, is whether he can keep those good people. Right? That's a big, with the kind of infighting that's going on at the top, how much latitude is he's said to people, look, you can't staff who you want and so forth because I have this loyal relationship with someone that the other person doesn't approve, and then lost those people's willingness to sustain the nomination. And so the question is, in some ways, who's next? And we don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. You, sir, standing at the back. Sorry. I saw his hand before yours. I'll call on you next.
Thanks.
I think there's some research that suggests that among college students, a strong percentage are libertarian as self-identified. So in an imaginary world in which the election had gone to an extremely competent libertarian candidate who became president, what would the first 100 days, if they were really successful, have looked like?
Well, less than what libertarians dream, I'm afraid. And I go back to, Washington is just way more complicated than it looks when you're not there. And it's a lot harder to get stuff done. And it's also easier to promise things than deliver them, because once you start talking about, look at how Obamacare went, right? Everyone loved the idea of Obamacare until they actually started talking about what it involved. When they got the details that they started freaking out. And that's a similar problem a libertarian candidate would face, is that say we nominated someone and elected them, their plans would sound better on paper than they did when you realize that the government program they're killing employs your uncle, right? And there's a lot of that. Policy has path dependence, and people often forget this. And this is the idea that undoing something is not the same as never having done it. And you think about quitting smoking is not the same as just not having started, is probably the best way to think about this. And so it doesn't look the same. It doesn't have the same outcomes. Sometimes once you've done something, and this is one reason I'm a libertarian, because once you start doing something, there's no backseas. Often you then foreclose good outcomes that were possible and are simply no longer possible. And I look at this with Obamacare, which I should, full disclosure, I opposed, is that I think there were better healthcare reforms that could have been done, even from a liberal perspective. We will never do those healthcare reforms now. All the political capital and all the money was spent on Obamacare. And so we are stuck with the choices that were made, and some of these choices look like they may end up being disastrous for the individual market. We don't know yet. We can't go back. And so that is a big problem that libertarians face in general, right? Maybe Social Security should never have been enacted, but it was. And now there are a whole lot of people who plan their lives around it being available and would have made different plans 40 years ago but didn't. What do you do with those people? Are you just going to tell them it's too bad you're 65, I guess you're going to have to keep working until you drop dead? That's, even if you're willing to say that, even if you're willing to say, look, it's hard, I understand you're going to have to lean in the strike zone and take one for the team, those people will get you out of office so fast. And that is the problem that libertarians face. That said, there's a ton of stuff that libertarians could do on better regulation. I think libertarians are in a great place on mass incarceration right now, which is really, there's a lot of exciting work being done on how we can have less crime and less incarceration. And I'm not just talking about decriminalizing drugs. Libertarians have a lot of great answers on deregulation, on using market mechanisms where they can. But that's the stuff we would be talking about. We would not be talking about repealing Social Security or Medicare, realistically. You, sir.
Three-part question.
Okay.
Who are the elites? What role should they or can they play in government? And how can they do a better job at that?
I would define the elites as people with high socioeconomic status, or the high SES group that you always hear about. They're not necessarily rich, but they're people with with quite a bit of social capital and political power. So I've been reading about the Boston busing scandal, and there's a really interesting sort of tidbit about this that follows a book called Common Ground, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1986. Highly recommend it. Follows three families. One Irish Catholic working class white in Charlestown, one upper middle class white in South End, Boston South End, and one in Roxbury, a black family in Roxbury. And here's the thing you see about the white family is that they have this school that they love, and their kids are supposed to be bussed away from it, and that doesn't happen. Right? Now, was that guy the most powerful person in the world? No, actually he was a Harvard-educated lawyer, but there are a lot of people who aren't Harvard-educated lawyers who nonetheless, they're hooked into the system. And they may be working for a nonprofit making $40,000 a year, but they know who to call. And they have a roommate from college. And they know a guy. And they know how the system works. Those people are the elites. What role should they have in government? I think realistically, they're going to have a lot of role in government. Right? It takes education to be in government.
Everything's really complicated now. It's not 1890. It's not 1830. There's a lot of just technical arcana. There's a lot of law writing. There's a lot of math. So realistically, we're going to get a lot of those people, especially at the higher levels. They're not going away. And I think like one sort of problem that you have with politics in America, and you witness this with other things. I've witnessed this by sort of looking at both sides of the Israel-Palestine dispute, and I'm not going to talk about taking sides about this, but I will say that when I talk to people on both sides, and they talk about what they want to happen, there is a moment at which I sense there's a fantasy that like the other people are just going to disappear. Like, no one wants to kill the other people. Just one day we'll wake up and they won't be there. Right? There's a lot of people in this country who have that fantasy. This is also true, by the way, my family, like, centuries back, hails from Northern Ireland. Exact same thing. The fantasy is just like one day the Catholics or the Protestants, one or the other, well, just, I don't know. Maybe they all went to Spain. It's warm and sunny there. They'll like it. We have that fantasy too. The cosmopolitan elites have the fantasy that like all the Trump voters are going to die. They're not. They're not dying off. It's a pretty rude fantasy to have, and I have heard a lot of people say literally that. We just have to wait for them to die. That is a horrifying thing to say about someone else in your own country. Also, it's not going to happen. So, but the other side seems to have this fantasy about the cosmopolitan elites, like they're just going to vanish. No. In fact, every country has a group of people who look a lot like this, and they tend to run things. That said, I think we made a lot of mistakes. Look, I'm an ardent free trader. I'm an ardent supporter of immigration. We ran roughshod over millions and millions of voters in this country. And when they told us they were unhappy, we were like, sorry, squirrel. Right? We made fun of them. We called them stupid for not understanding that trade and immigration were good. And then you know what it turned out? There's now research suggesting that in fact China trade was really bad for those people. And all the stuff we told them was wrong. All of our high-end economic theories. Now, in our defense, China was a one-off. China is just so big. It's not like this is going to keep happening. China really was, it was so big and it happened so fast when they got into the WTO that it was a unique event in world history that will not be repeated. That said, we were wrong. Are we sorry about that? Did we have any inkling that we might be the ones who were wrong? Or were we snotty to them? No, we were snotty to them. I was there. We did a lot of that over and over and over again. We looked down on them and we let them know it. People don't like that. We have to stop. And look, I've argued, I was not a supporter of Trump in the election. We at Bloomberg do not endorse. I did not endorse either Trump or Hillary Clinton. I noted a lot of hard, as I have tonight. I noted a lot of problems with his candidacy, a lot of problems with how he conducted himself. And a lot of people got really angry at me. And I think that those voters, they were mistaken in a lot of their assessments of what Trump would do. I think a lot of Clinton's voters were really mistaken with their assessments of what she would do too. That's another discussion for a different day. I can't change people who are making mistakes. I can change me. If we think that they made a mistake, if we think that their voting for Trump was wrong, okay, it's wrong. Can you change them? No, you can change yourself. We made a lot of mistakes. We picked fights we didn't have to have. We did not listen to other people in our country. We did not treat them as if we cared about them. And if you treat people as if you don't care about them, why would they let you run things? You saw this with Brexit, right? I think one of the most telling moments for Brexit with me was, and this went viral on my Facebook feed, everyone loved it. Don't these people understand how they're making it hard for me to move abroad and take a job and marry abroad? And yes, they get it. You know what? They don't want you to. They want you to be loyal to them. Because you're saying I should run things. I don't feel any loyalty to you. You're dumb and you live in some small town. You don't even eat sushi, right? If you treat people like that, they're gonna be like, well then, okay, you don't run things anymore. Why would I let you run my life if you treat me like that? That's the position we're in. We did not respect our voters. We did not treat them as if they were fellow Americans that we loved. We did not say frankly, we did not often enough say, I love my country because it's my country, I love it the best. And I love you guys the best because you're my fellow Americans. In the same way that I love my husband because he's my husband. And I love him the best, and he is the best husband. I tell him this all the time. Does this mean I think you've got a terrible spouse? No. We understand we're adults. You're supposed to love things because they're yours. We stop saying that. They don't trust us, and they don't trust us for a reason, and we got to fix that. Sorry, that was like a bit of a rant, but this is really heartfelt, is that I think this is a good time for elites to look into their hearts and say, whatever their quarrels are with Trump voters, what did I do wrong, and how could I do differently? Any other questions? No, I see the natives are getting restless. Thank you for your patience.